Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics. I'm Anita, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan.
Thanks, and glad to be here.
Trade has been a major issue for the Trump administration, and I recently spoke with William A Reinsch, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, on all aspects of this topic. We discuss what Americans really think about trade, tariffs and why they might be here to stay, why some of our trading partners are getting extensions, and the need to work with our allies to become less dependent on China. Another major story in the headlines is the Russia-Ukraine war, particularly Trump's meetings with both leaders. We discuss the outcome of these meetings, their unusual nature, and the chances of peace. Finally, we also explore potential U.S. military strikes into Latin America to go after cartels and the current situation in Iran. So summer has been winding down. I've been teaching classes. Becca's about to start school on Tuesday.
Yeah, I think we're getting fully into fall. We did just do kind of one of the big Pokemon Go events for the season, which attracted a lot of attention. For those that don't know, Pokemon Go is still going on. We're actually constantly approached on the street because we play here in Bethesda, and this event, one of the bigger ones of the year, had literally 100 people.
130 people.
Is 130 people?
That's what they counted. At least at some point in the day, they all together
had 130 people. So yeah, you had this gigantic group walking around, and we were thinking, what do people think of that? It's either like a protest, or you go in to or from a sporting event or whatnot.
People are confused.
Yeah, so I would say at least 2 or 3 times during the event, the hour we're walking there, somebody comes up and asks, like, what you're doing. And you have to say Pokemon Go, and they're like, probably thinking back to 2016. Like, oh, that's still going on. But yeah, I don't know. It still has millions of players worldwide. Yeah, even though they always point to it as a trend of 2016, it's very, very active base. It's very large. And it's evidence that Bethesda's not very big and it can get 130 people to an event easily. Yeah, so I think the controversy has been, so the original company that founded it, Niantic, based out of Chicago, sold it recently for $3.5 billion. So what's happened is there's been a lot more events, and it's a lot more pay-for-play sort of activity going on. This is definitely that case, but it got people out in huge numbers. They're working to make back that $3 billion and probably made back like $1 billion of it over the last 3 or 4 days. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, even though we were disappointed by the main super powerful Pokemon. That was the feature of the event.
Yeah, and then we're also excited about football season starting.
Yeah, because you're defending your, God, I can't believe it. You won last year after a hiatus of, I think, like 2 or 3 years, which, so this league has been going on. It's just a family and friends league, and it's been going on for 14 years now. This is the 14th season, of which Anita has won
7.
Half of them. Right. Over half of them then. That's what you're saying. 7 out of 13.
Oh, I thought you said 14.
Yeah, we're going into the 14th season. Oh. Yeah, so she's won half. We call her Coach Belichick, which used to be a compliment. And now, because of his recent situation, for those that follow college football, he's now a college football coach with a very younger, interesting, pretty dominant personality girlfriend who stole a lot of the headlines over the summer. So it's a bit of a circus. So I don't know if you'll pick up that part where you're just kind of classic Belichick. You're going Belichick for that center.
I have all the haters like the Patriots did, because everybody else in the league is always hating on me.
Yeah, so that's 100% back. Before it was dying out a little bit because it had been several years since you won, but now 100% back.
It's terrible.
So yeah, we'll see how the season goes. I know both of our college football teams are horrible. So there's basically nothing to be excited about, I think, with,
we're excited anyway.
With both of them. Yeah, we're still excited. But I am very excited about the Commanders. They're supposedly the 6th best NFL team in the league. And obviously with the heroic performance of rookie sensation Jaden Daniels last year, expectations are sky high heading into the main season.
Really, this is all because of me.
All because of you. What'd you do?
Well, when I went to Chicago, they won a Super Bowl. I went to LA, the Rams won a Super Bowl. So
what, like 8 years later?
So they weren't even playing there that long. It's not like the Rams were there as soon as I moved to LA. I'm not saying the Commanders are going to win.
Because, you did officially join the Commanders fan base last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and maybe. So you're saying it's that and maybe a little bit from Jane Daniels.
I'm saying I bring very good luck to teams.
Okay. Well, hopefully that'll continue and they'll at least, match the performance that the Bears did when you moved to Chicago and make the Super Bowl. That'd be pretty good.
So I guess we should get into it.
Yep.
So first, we're going to start with the Trump-Putin meeting, which was followed by a meeting with Zelensky and European leaders, and all that means for the status of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, so it's definitely been an interesting past couple of weeks where there's been a huge diplomatic push by the Trump administration in order to come up with a quick solution to the Ukraine event. Not exactly the 24 hours that he promised, but certainly at the beginning of this made it sound like, we can get this resolved within the next couple of weeks. So it's really headlined by the meeting between Trump and Putin up in Anchorage, Alaska. And that was fairly disappointing overall in terms of the outcome from it. It actually ended several hours earlier than expected. But for Putin was really a huge diplomatic win. I mean, because one, this guy is a wanted war criminal because of his actions and brutality in the occupied villages within Ukraine. Between the torture, which has been documented, and the relocation of Ukrainian children into Russia, he's wanted by the International Criminal Court, but U.S. not being a signatory member, and then obviously the Trump administration being fairly pro-Russia, he was invited to U.S. soil and given a full red carpet diplomatic display, which included Trump greeting him on the tarmac and having a B-2 bomber fly over, kind of in honor of Putin visiting the U.S. for the first time since 2007.
At least it wasn't the White House.
That's true. It wasn't a full state dinner. So I guess that's something. So again, the overall meeting there was kind of a dud. It lasted only a couple of hours. They didn't even stay for dinner, which included some sort of salmon. So particularly insulting, you go to Alaska and you don't even stay for dinner for the salmon. But the things that really disturbed Zelensky and his European allies was the fact that in typical Trumpian fashion, that whoever he spoke to last, he tends to reflect their sentiments. So coming out of this meeting, he had dropped the need for a ceasefire, which was a provision pushed by Russia as kind of a necessity, where it was rather pushed by Europeans as a necessity for a potential peace deal. The Russians were not interested in that. So Trump kind of was supporting the Russian position. And then also this idea of a land swap was much more aligned with what Russia's demands were around ending the conflict.
Obviously this concerned European leaders. So it was quite extraordinary that Zelensky was accompanied by so many European leaders, including Macron and other European states, to try to get Trump's ear as quickly as possible before his mind settled too much into what he thought this peace deal would look like.
Yeah, that part was really extraordinary because the meeting between Putin and Trump happened on a Friday. And then by Monday, you basically had 7 heads of state from the various EU countries parachute in together with Zelensky to the White House. So extraordinary, unprecedented effort in order to help influence. And you could tell, in the meeting itself that they've learned a lot, particularly Zelensky since, the disastrous meeting in the White House in February. He was much more conciliatory, made sure to thank Trump multiple times, wore a suit, which, he got complimented by Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend, who apparently is the main reporter now within the White House, gets a lot of the questions. So And then did a tour of the MAGA gift shop that lies just outside of the Oval Office now. So all the merch that you can pick up when you visit the White House. And so real classy event overall. They played much more. So the visit itself went much better, so that coming out of that, there was actually more of a conversation about the security guarantees that would be required on the Ukrainian side. So I think that's really kind of where the focus is the land, the territory swap kind of proposed, which, we call a swap, but really it's about Russia being granted additional territory. I actually didn't find, I think there's some small areas kind of in the northern part of the country that are Russian occupied. But compared to the strategic significance of what Russia wants, which is in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass and the Donetsk Oblast, there's this one area that's been about a 30-mile stretch that's been reinforced since 2014, so when Russia first invaded the Donbass. And it's seen as a strategic linchpin for Ukraine. So it's a series of 4 different cities, heavily reinforced, with the dragon teeth, with the trenches, with barbed wire. And the loss of that territory would be seen as a strategic blow because it would open up central Ukraine to potential invasion. And so there's a great reluctance, not to mention the fact that it has 250,000 Ukrainian civilians still living within that territory. So just from the start, it's a kind of a non-starter to give up, existing territory that the Russians, according to the International Institute for the Study of War, would take another 3 or 4 years in order to take this stretch of land. So obviously it's of great interest to Russia. It creates a nice conduit for future pressure, presumably that they can have a ceasefire and some sort of tentative agreement. Russia, of course, envisioning it as weakened Ukraine over time, but over the coming years, if they can get sanction relief, Russia can rebuild its army and then be much more strategically positioned to kind of finish the job with Ukraine.
That's what also made these security guarantees so interesting, which are considered Article 5-like protections on the table. So Ukraine would not be a part of NATO, but you would have individual countries committing to sort of Article 5. If you're attacked, we automatically respond, which is kind of a weird concept, and nobody is quite sure how that would work.
Yeah, and that's something that was floated out by Witkoff, kind of in his discussion with Witkoff is Trump's golfing buddy and real estate, who's basically been heading up most diplomatic efforts, not the State Department or Mark Rubio. This is all just Witkoff having conversations with high-level Russian officials. So that's probably not worth anything, these Article 5-like protections. It's also not clear exactly how that would work. The most concrete effort that is happening is European-led, and I think whatever emerges has to be 90% EU forces. But so the UK and France have been actively meeting and holding military planning sessions and trying to build this coalition of willing nations within the EU to dedicate troops following whatever agreement, if that's ever reached within Ukraine. But yeah, in terms of how, if Russia were to invade again, what exactly that would trigger, that's the big question. Also,
because Article 5, to many people, does not actually mean necessarily troops on the ground. It means that countries are obligated to provide support, but that support can be in many forms. So that's one of the technicalities of these sort of proposals.
Yeah. So it's very unclear kind of what role the U.S. would play in these security guarantees. It is something that, Trump has said initially, particularly again, the last thing you heard following the meeting with Zelensky and EU leaders, there was kind of coming out of his mouth, talks about security guarantees. But then the next day said, well, U.S. troops would not be on the ground. But that does still leave open the very critical role of having the logistics and intelligence, and then the idea of a backstop as well. So if Russia did invade, that the U.S. would be committed to entering a more significant way, to at least backstop European defense. So if Europe was on the front lines fighting off Russian forces, that the U.S. would be kind of at least provide troops to provide defense to NATO territory.
A couple other interesting points are the necessity of EU accession for Ukraine to be part of any peace deal that Ukraine would accept. And then also these points that, what will change things? What will change the two sides that seem to be dug in and nowhere near compromise? That means the U.S. has to use some leverage, right? And that means that the U.S. has to be willing to escalate sanctions or increase armaments to Ukraine to communicate that Russia's army in the long term will be destroyed. But as long as we just allow this stalemate to continue as it is, it's pretty much a win for Russia as they continue to just grind this war down.
Yeah, I mean, as we've talked about lots before, I mean, it's Russia has the superior manpower and they're willing to sacrifice into this meat grinder. And then obviously there's a lot politically, domestically that Putin gains from continuing the war. Mm-hmm. So it's really only the pressure, which has entirely been dropped. And that maybe that's part of the win that Putin got was, supposedly Trump was getting tough on Russia and that they only had 2 weeks in order to comply and stop attacking Ukrainian cities, or, going to impose secondary sanctions on countries like India that buy Russian oil, things like that. The fundamental things that if you did cut off the Russian oil supply, oil revenue, never mind kind of the impact globally, but that would have a material impact on the ability of Russia to wage war. The other thing in terms of escalation is allowing Ukraine again to strike targets deep within Russian territory and providing them the armaments in order to do so. So without that sort of escalation, yeah, you're right, Russia has no incentive to end the conflict.
In the analysis I read, it looked a lot like signals that Trump is giving up on a quick resolution to this conflict so that things may not change. He may not push for change anytime in the near future.
Yeah, that was actually something reported in the Washington Post within the last day, that he's sort of kind of just typical. If he doesn't feel like he can get a quick win, then he abandons the issue. And that, again, goes back to the more conspiratorial sort of things, that this is just about creating news cycles, which he's a master at, and distracting from a lot of his domestic problems, including kind of the Epstein issue. So regardless, he succeeded because he's dominated the last 2 weeks, through these diplomatic show efforts. Mm-hmm. So yeah, fundamentally, nothing has changed. Putin still has completely maximalist goals. As recently as June, he was basically claiming domestically within the Russian media that all of Ukraine belongs to them, that Ukraine is not a legitimate nation state. And when you have somebody kind of with that and with such big differences between the two parties, there's actually little that Trump can do to force an end to the issue. Because on the other side of the coin, Ukraine has the ability to continue the conflict, and as long as Europe is willing to provide the resources, Ukraine's not going to accept the Russian proposal.
So yeah, it was a lot of action without any significant results.
Yeah, no, I mean, I read some stuff where everybody got a little something that they wanted. Obviously, we know what Putin got. I mean, that's a big win for him. Trump got obviously all the visuals are always good. Mm-hmm. He had European leaders dropping everything. These are all leaders of their nations.
I know, that's why it was so
dropped
crazy.
at the drop of a hat their schedules to fly to Washington, D.C. and basically grovel in front of Trump, which he loves. So he got a win from that. And then Europe, I guess, avoided disaster.
Well, I guess that's something.
And they're talking about security guarantees, which is something, I guess. Mm-hmm. So everybody got something out of it, but ultimately nothing changed fundamentally on the ground.
You kind of brought to my attention the story that I had missed about Trump's plans, potential plans to begin using military force against Latin American cartels that have been designated as terrorist organizations. Now, obviously, in the campaign, there was talk of doing this, but there's still questions around the legality of doing so and how Latin American leaders will respond.
Yeah, so this was interesting. I mean, and most of this came out of a New York Times story from August 8th that Trump had secretly signed a directive to begin using military force against 8 different Latin American cartels that have been designated terrorist organizations. So this includes cartels like MS-13 and the Venezuelan group, the Cartel of the Suns, have been mostly named so far. Interestingly, on the Venezuelan cartel, that the administration's actually asserted that the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, is the head of it. And you actually have Rubio being quoted that he's currently indicted by the U.S. for the cartel's criminal narco trafficking scheme and actually has a bounty on his head for $50 million. I guess this bounty has actually existed for a while. It was only recently doubled to $50 million.
I found this quite extraordinary about Maduro. Of course, U.S. has a tense relationship previously, or a long-term tense relationship with him. I believe he is not acknowledged as the leader of Venezuela, or unless that was reversed at some point in time. But during elections where it appears the opposition leader won, persuaded several countries, including the U.S., to de-recognize Maduro in favor of these opposition leaders. But tying him to a cartel and as head of this cartel is something that seems very new, a development, and definitely has interesting implications.
Yeah, no, I thought the same as well. And the New York Times article also pointed out, some of the historical precedents that aren't directly like this, but are somewhat similar. And I'd personally forgotten the details. We were the same age in 1989, but this is probably the first action by the U.S. military that I had like a memory of and watching on TV at the time. Because I think we had gotten CNN probably by this point in 1989. But yeah, so the U.S. sent, for those not familiar, they sent 20,000 troops to Panama to arrest Manuel Noriega, who had actually been indicted in the U.S. on charges of drug trafficking. So you have a head of state of Panama that had been indicted on criminal charges, on drug trafficking. And that was actually the legal authority. It was actually William Barr, a younger William Barr, who was the former attorney general under the first Trump administration, drafted this at the time for President George H.W. Bush, that gave them the authority to direct law enforcement arrest of fugitive overseas without the consent of foreign states. Now, the action was condemned at the time by the UN, but it was essentially sending 20,000 troops to arrest a foreign head of state. So maybe that's kind of the precedent. And the legal authority it wasn't just controversial internationally, it was also controversial within the U.S. So it's not something I guess legal scholars agree upon, that the president can actually do this. But I'm imagining this is combined with the fact that they've classified the organization as a terrorist organization, as seen as giving much more legal leeway in terms of using the Defense Department in order to implement these actions.
So yeah, your points about Noriega are interesting. Unlike you, I must be significantly younger by the whole 3 weeks.
That whole 3 weeks, yeah.
Because I did not watch it on television. I only have the faintest memories of the name of Noriega, but not really any context to details. So I think it is interesting to compare that to the possibilities Trump may be talking about today. What I remember about Noriega the most is the lasting controversy over it in political circles.
Yeah. And I, of course, as a kid, I did not pick up on any of these nuances at all. I remember
the controversy.
Oh, really? You remember it?
Yeah, like I don't remember seeing on TV or any details of it. I just remember that being like a thing that people had very different opinions on.
Oh, okay. The only thing I remember is it was explained by my dad because I, at the time, was a big fan of G.I. Joe. And he was basically like, Noriega is like the Cobra Commander, who's the head bad guy. Also head of a terrorist organization. He wasn't involved in drugs, though, even though this was the peak, like Nancy Reagan war on drugs. And then I remember that in order to, because they had surrounded the presidential compound and they started playing like loud music. And I only remember like watching that. Like the troops are just like playing loud, like heavy metal music or something to annoy Noriega. And then eventually they arrested him. But yeah, I don't remember any of the controversy. I just remember those two things.
I'm just fascinated by your dad explaining this through G.I. Joe.
What? It was in the G.I. Joe. That makes sense, you know. It's G.I. Joe is basically U.S. Special Forces. So, I mean, and obviously the U.S. has other actions around, particularly on this war on drugs that continued through the 80s and 90s with U.S. military assisted activities in Colombia and Peru. And I know you've studied Colombia quite a bit, the Colombia plan. And did you want to add any kind of detail about kind of U.S.'s efforts and what? They're certainly more constrained than what we did in Panama. There weren't like U.S. troops actively, battling FARC or the drug cartels, but we certainly provided a lot of assistance.
We had like at least 2,000 troops, I think. 2,000.
Oh, okay. We'll take that back. So, was that for training purposes though, like training Colombian special forces, or?
I think mostly in support roles.
Yeah,
but very significant presence. I mean, there's a huge difference, though. Colombia came to the U.S. begging for those troops, right? I mean, it wasn't even the U.S. saying, oh, we'd like to work with you. It was Colombians saying, like, we're a failed state. The only way we can get our country back is if we have your support. Now, they were also asking for economic support, but they just got the military aid. But it made a big difference. But I think this is a totally different thing.
Yeah, I think, in terms of what's being proposed, very different. And I think the controversy comes back and because it really puts the military in this role of directly capturing or killing people involved in the drug trade. Also, terrorist organizations normally have political goals. And, one of the key differences that was laid out by the Washington Office on Latin America is that, criminal organizations are motivated by profit. Mm-hmm. And they often work hand in hand with the government in which they corrupt through bribes, which is a huge problem, throughout Latin America and Mexico in particular. I mean, it's the cartels deeply penetrate local municipalities and states, paying off local police, paying off mayors, paying off higher federal government officials. So it's a real issue that's very different than a counterterrorism operation like against ISIS or something.
Right. Now, some of these have been terrorists. Like FARC was a terrorist organization with
but it had political goals.
Right.
I mean, it was a Marxist leftist organization that had political goals against either a far right or a central right government within Colombia.
Right. So that's another difference. The thing, that I'm just thinking about in all of this, one, I'm still really intrigued what will happen with Venezuela. But for the rest of these countries, you're going in not necessarily with their permission to enter, is what I'm hearing? Or is it assumed that they will make negotiations so that the countries approve? You
get kind of a mixed view on that. But I think the Atlantic Council had a nice report. So there is significant cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico, even though, a lot of the rhetoric is kind of framed around, and certainly how it was framed like during the presidential campaign, is that we're going to just do these special forces strikes on Mexican territory and the hell with what Mexico thinks. But in reality, we actually have an agreement that was approved by the Mexican Senate this year that approved the presence of the U.S. Army's 7th Special Forces Group. And they're conducting joint training with Mexico's Special Forces, SEDENA. And I think the unique thing, There's certainly a lot of complications, a lot of corruption within many areas of the Mexican military that may make this sort of operation difficult. But this particular special forces group, at least according to the Atlantic Council, was seen as a trusted partner within it. So I think what was envisioned is that if there were going to be targeted strikes, it would be in conjunction with Mexican special forces.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense to me. I wonder if this is any part of the trade negotiations with Mexico, which recently got a 90-day extension, or if not directly part of the negotiations, which I doubt it would be, if it's somewhere in the talk under the table.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's definitely being used as leverage, and it's something that, because the U.S. is seeking much greater latitude and the ability to strike these cartels. And it goes back to the original, I mean, even Canada was caught up in the fentanyl trade.
Very small.
Right, yeah. But it was used as the main excuse. It's like, well, fentanyl is getting into the U.S. and it's large. I mean, 95% of it's coming from Mexico.
Yeah, it's very
and then
small.
5% is coming from Canada. But it was still being used as a leverage item as part of trade negotiations as well. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which has not gone as well between Canada and the U.S.
No, that hasn't gone well at all. So it's kind of interesting. I think the other thing the Atlantic Council pointed out was the Sinaloa cartel would likely be the first target. And that's because it's the most powerful cartel in the Western Hemisphere and engages in beyond drug trafficking, also has human trafficking, illegal mining, illegal oil sales, and business extortion. And also has deep ties to China via the fentanyl trade. So this would be seen as the likely target for any initial action by the U.S. So it definitely seems like something is building up around this. The other thing, bringing Venezuela back into it, is you had a series of warships that were deployed off the Venezuelan coast. This was shortly after kind of the announcement of doubling the reward for Maduro's arrest and capture. And I think that probably goes back to your point, is like, is there some sort of greater end game? Because this is definitely one of Rubio's passion projects.
Right.
Beyond like Iran, which is, we'll talk about shortly and has largely been neutralized. Venezuela is definitely something Rubio, and regime change is something that is a certain passion project. So having that Noriega comparison, I can't imagine. Venezuela's military is pretty capable.
Well, that's what I was just thinking. Because literally when you talked about warships, I was like, oh, yeah, this is not Panama without a military. Right. Venezuela has a significant military.
Yeah. And I was reading a report. I mean, Maduro, as a result of this action, has activated the 4 million militia members. Now, how capable is this 4 million? Still, it's 4 million men under arms. So it's not something where you're going to walk into Caracas and be able to lay siege to the compound.
And these are the only people really getting food. So they are very dependent on the state and pretty loyal to the state.
Right.
So yeah, you can't just send in 20,000 troops.
Which isn't the U.S. provision as of late, because I think the other interesting thing that's kind of been bubbling up is just the use of special forces is actually a lot wider than I think is fully understood, probably since Obama onwards, just because the negative impact of the Iraq war, the Afghanistan war, the commitment of huge amounts of troops. But the U.S. has been leaning more and more on the use of special forces to carry out operations. Now, I can't imagine Maduro would. Yeah, I don't know.
That's a huge violation of not only international law, but just precedent. I mean, you can't assassinate other national leaders.
How is it different than what Trump did with Soleimani? Because Soleimani wasn't a national leader, but we assassinated.
Not even head of state.
Yeah, okay. But it's not recognized as a head of state. Everything is being set up. We don't recognize him as a head of state. He's a head of a cartel.
He's still the de facto head of a state.
Yeah, but we don't care. We don't recognize. It's the guy, the opposition leader that was elected. We recognize him as the head of state. I'm not saying this would be the biggest special op. To be able to pull this off would be pretty extraordinary. But is it building to something like this where
how would it be the second biggest violation of international norms?
Who's going to do anything about it, though?
I mean, it's on par with Russia invading, for territorial.
No, it's not on par with that.
In terms of international norms, not assassinate. Of course, it's appealing to assassinate political leaders all the time. There's a firm rule you cannot assassinate a political leader. And by that, I mean head of state.
Head of state.
Yeah, not
yeah, because we constantly, people have significant political power within their...
Right. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about heads of state.
But this is now a terrorist organization. This is a head of a terrorist organization, is how the White House has framed it. Not only is he not the head of the nation state of Venezuela, he is also the head of a drug cartel that has now been designated a terrorist state. So this is now the equivalent of just going after the head of ISIS, which we absolutely do and have a track record of assassinating these people.
Yeah, but I don't know. He's still the facto.
It's also, what is the blowback going to be?
It would be huge. I mean, I don't know what people can do about it, but I'm telling you, there's been a lot of terrible political leaders, heads of states, that we have hated and detested, and we did not assassinate them. There's precedents for arresting them, but there's absolutely no precedent in the post-World War II era of a head of state ever being assassinated. It opens up the whole countries then start trying to assassinate each other's leaders. I mean, there's a reason why that precedent exists.
This is a very unlikely event, but it does raise kind of the questions on engagement. I mean, I think they are going back to like Mexico or any of these cartel actions. Right, it's very much going to be the action of special forces. And I think even legally there.
Venezuela.
Yeah, I know. But this all kind of ties in because this is the whole point, is that Venezuela is now being grouped as a drug cartel. Maduro's the head of a drug cartel, according to the White House's definition, of which is now a terrorist organization.
But he is also a de facto head of state.
Not recognized by the United States, though.
I mean, I think, wasn't Syria's leader Assad, wasn't that considered a terrorist state? We definitely
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that was fully...
Yeah, we definitely have countries that are designated as terrorist states. You still can't assassinate their leaders.
Yeah, but I think there's a difference between
No.
We still recognize them as a head of state, though. What I'm saying is that not only it's the terrorism, plus we don't recognize them as a legitimate leader based on that last election.
But that's pretty flimsy.
We've gone to war for less.
Again, we would have to go to an actual war with Venezuela. We're not going to do that.
If we are carving the world back into spheres of influence, this would be seen as an alpha move action to reassert the Monroe Doctrine. That's just it's just kind of interesting seeing them trying to build up these flimsy legal pieces in order to justify these potential future actions, of which... Obviously, the military is being used for purposes that it wasn't really originally intended. I mean, we're seeing that domestically a lot.
Did you point out there's a constitutional law, or there's a law, 1878 law, called the...
Posse Comitatus Act.
That makes it illegal to use the military to perform law enforcement functions. And that's been very controversial here in D.C. because you're not supposed to use the military for law enforcement.
Yeah, and I obviously don't care. So I'm saying, why is anybody going to care for Venezuela?
I'd be floored if that happened.
Yeah, I think just because it wouldn't be easy to execute necessarily.
We could have gone after leaders with the CIA for a long time. We just don't do that.
We did in the 50s and 60s. This used to be like regular practice in South America. We would just... Yeah, but going back, I mean, I think there are a bunch of interesting legal precedents, because even... Going to a much lower level, does special forces have the right to just execute cartels? And I think that was the whole idea of the terrorist organization.
Yeah.
Because the idea was if they're going to do law enforcement, they'd have to try to detain them unless they try to use lethal force against them, in which case they have a right to defend themselves. It's all kind of messy, but I'm thinking this is the reason you designate them as a terrorist organization. Then you have the leeway to just go in and kill them.
Yeah.
Without much. Yeah. So, yeah, it just stood out to me. I mean, it's going to be interesting. It definitely seems like they're moving forward. You could see it politically, domestically playing well. I mean, how does like killing drug trafficking, human trafficking criminal groups not popular? It's going to be popular.
As long as they don't do something like try to assassinate Maduro.
That would be...
That will not be.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, no. I think that gets extremely ugly. That seems really ambitious, but it's like, well, what is the end game by doubling his reward, sending destroyers? What's kind of the point of doing this unless something's kind of building towards you think you can have regime change or decapitate the Venezuelan regime?
I don't know. But that would be a huge mistake on so many levels.
And the whole point of this, and I think even with the drug cartels, is it's extremely ineffective.
Right? It's like whack-a-mole, right?
Exactly, yeah. They're just going to move. They're extremely flexible organizations. They're driven by economic incentive. As long as there's demand, and there's always going to be demand because people want to dissociate from their lives within Western countries, particularly the United States, where unfortunately life is really hard for a good chunk of the population. So there's always going to be demand for drugs, and these cartels are always going to fulfill that demand for drugs.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing. As long as there's demand, there will always be people providing it. So you break up one cartel. Well, there are competing cartels. They just become the main cartel then. They get to bribe the politicians and set up their organization.
Yeah. I
mean there's always somebody right there. It's not even like, oh, a new cartel has to form. There are all these competing cartels, and it's just like one takes over from the other.
I'm thinking the best outcome is something like with Colombia. Colombia's cocaine production is at like record highs. It's much higher than it was under Escobar. Mm-hmm. Famous Escobar who nearly challenged the power of the Colombian state. Mm-hmm. Very centralized control of cocaine production. And, he was taken out. But now, cocaine production is higher than it was during that period, but it's very decentralized. It's much more competitive market, I guess, where you just have a lot more smaller producers. That's all that's going to happen to Mexico. You'll have just as much product coming out. It's just going to be decentralized, which is probably good from a corruption and nation state standpoint.
Sure it'll just be smaller producers. I think.
You think it can reconstitute itself. Well, then it becomes a whack-a-mole where you're just doing it. Kind of the same with terrorist organizations. Like we've constantly had to kill Al-Qaeda leaders, but we've kept it from like building to the point where it could take over a nation state again,
right?
Like ISIS.
I guess if you keep at it, you can weaken them, but you're not going to get rid of them.
Yeah, you're never going to get rid of them.
And you have to maintain that same military involvement continuously. If you say, oh, we're done with this operation, we're going to go home, then that's when you just have the new major cartel forming who's doing all the bribing. And
yeah, so it seems like the best play is something similar with like a play in Colombia. If you're going to do that with like Mexico, let's just focus on Mexico.
But it's not going to get rid of the drug trade.
No, you're never going to get rid of the drug trade. But the whole point is that you slowly over time like decorrupt the Mexican state, or at least minimize the crime. I mean, because it's not like Colombia's clean.
Right.
But can you, at least at the federal level, keep that relatively clean, where a cartel from gaining so much power that it literally can reach into the upper echelons of the government?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think the idea of like our special forces training them, you have this high level of cooperation, you do these targeted things to maybe break up bigger cartels. But this whole idea of doing something without the express approval of the Mexican government is just stupid.
Right.
Let alone the Venezuela stuff, which is probably just way out there. And that's probably real stupid.
Very. I don't actually see that happening, but I've been surprised before. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops more. So just to kind of conclude, you brought up what is happening with Iran now that the 12-day war is over. There's been no discussion. It's not in the news, yet it still has some capacity probably to be working toward a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and this will be a pretty quick update. I mean, I was just curious myself because it has kind of really fallen out of the news. You had this very dramatic 12 days. You had the U.S.-led strike. And then the cessation of hostilities. So it was like, well, what's going on? So it was interesting. So, I mean, the International Atomic Energy Agency came out with kind of a neutral third-party assessment, and they determined that Iran's enrichment capability has been heavily degraded and fully incapacitated. Now, that being said, that has to do with their enrichment capability. They had a lot of already rich components in stock. So the thought was that many experts think that Tehran could recoup and rebuild its losses over months or a few years, and that really the core components, such as the enriched uranium and centrifuges that were not installed at the time of the attack, probably survived the strikes and could be redirected towards a crash program to develop a nuclear weapon within a year. So I think that's ultimately, wasn't that everything was obliterated, like the Trump administration said, but it was set back significantly. But obviously, we talked about this before, the Iranian regime has complete incentive now to develop a nuclear bomb as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. Because the other thing that's really emerged is that it's lost everything in terms of its proxy ability, with the exception of the Houthis. Right. I kind of threw that in there.
Because we kind of gave up attacking the Houthis.
Yeah, because that was such a big deal. And of course, you had the scandal with the Signal Gate. No, what was that?
Oh, yeah, where they discussed the details of an attack on the Houthis on the Signal app.
Yep. Yeah, so we had over 1,000 different strikes, but then all of that wrapped up.
Without accomplishing anything.
Before all of these events cost, I don't know how many tens of billions of dollars.
Well, that's why we stopped.
Because we were running out of...
Yeah, we were depleting these expensive missiles without really accomplishing anything.
Yeah. So then literally 2 months later, the Houthis struck 2 different ships in the Red Sea. And I guess kind of and this is from an Economist article back in July, because I had missed this completely. This was actually in July when this happened. The world actually didn't make much note of it. And I think, again, most shipments for Western shipping companies now go around the Horn of Africa and we've just kind of built that in to the cost structure. The ship that was struck was actually a Chinese, I think it was shipping stuff from China to Turkey. But because it went to port in Israel, and again, the Houthis, at least in terms of how they communicate, this is all in support of what's going on in Gaza, which of course is horrific, but will continue attacking vessels as long as the Gazan situation doesn't improve. But that's the only proxy that has Iranian support. And clearly they're still somehow getting armaments from Iran that's active. Because even Iraq, who's obviously right next door to Iran, another Economist article talked about how much that it has been weakening over time. And you actually saw it during the lead up to the U.S. bombing campaign of the nuclear facilities, as Iran actually was trying to get its Iraqi proxies to attack U.S. bases, and they weren't willing to do so. So, I mean, obviously Iran's been, its proxies destroyed. It was left out in the cold by its allies, Russia and China. It's in this very weakened state, but it has been able to consolidate. Obviously there's no viable political opposition within the state, but it has been cracking down internally. So looking for people that were potentially intelligence leaks to Israel, because obviously Israel had completely compromised Iranian intelligence. So there's been a number of arrests and executions around that. And then I think domestically, Khomeini is seen as being in very poor health. So there is work on trying to find, succession for him. So it's like the state and the structure, which we talked about before, is such that they're going to find there's no challenge to the Islamic regime, and that's a complicated enough of an organization that taking out a single individual or lots of individuals like Israel did in these strikes, it still has the ability to reconstitute itself. And there's no other game in town, so there's no fundamental change from that. It's just Iran's in a weakened state, and it has 100% more incentive to build a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. And it's in the position, we think, to do so.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting, to see what develops.
It puts the onus on, can Israel continue to have just complete ownership of the intelligence environment within Iran so that it knows as Iran goes fully underground with its nuclear kind of crash program, can Israeli intelligence identify it and then have additional strikes to prevent this weapon being built? So I think that's going to be the game going forward. There's other stuff about potentially another deal. Would Trump try to reconstitute the nuclear deal? But my thought is why would Iran trust the U.S. at all in any of this? And why is that more incentive than other than maybe sanction relief? I wouldn't trust Trump on that.
I think, the play now for Iran is to allow Trump to think he won. I mean, this is the whole idea where we don't hear about it. Trump is like to his followers, we won this.
It's a total victory, being framed that way.
So we don't have to worry about Iran now. And as long as Iran stays fairly under the radar, then it could potentially develop this nuclear weapon without having too much interference from the U.S. But like you said, Israel intelligence is
deeply penetrated the Iranian state, so it seems.
I don't think that they'll really be able to do that either.
Yeah, unless their counterintelligence operations become a lot more effective than they have been.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that happening.
I can't imagine. Yeah, they just seem very weak and incompetent. So I can't see that improving dramatically. So yeah, you saw a little bit of a rally around the flag effect within Iran. So yeah, no imminent collapse of the Iranian regime by any.
Well, finally, we have my interview with William A Reinsch at CSIS. So he's an economics expert, and we talked about all things related to trade, as I explained in the intro. So as I teased, sort of about what Americans really say about free trade, the popularity or not of tariffs, their effect on inflation or not. Also, I thought it was interesting, we talked about Trump can levy tariffs without Congress. So could the next president get rid of them just as easily? But how that would actually be really hard to do due to the revenue that they're bringing into the U.S. government. We also talked about China dealing with that either through tariffs versus industrial policy, and the importance of allies, right? So this idea that despite what the Trump administration seems to emphasize, that we can make everything in the United States, the practicality was we cannot. So why does the U.S. not put any emphasis on friendshoring as a solution to reducing our dependence on China? We talked about all these topics and more, and I think you'll really enjoy the interview and some expertise on some of the main issues of the day. Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Anita Kellogg. I'm here with William Reinsch, a senior advisor and Scroll Chair Emeritus at CSIS with expertise of all things trade-related. Hi, Bill. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Happy to be with you. Honored to be invited.
Oh, well, it's such a pleasure. There seems to be a dominant narrative that free trade was an idea sold to Americans by elites who ignored how it affected the middle class through the loss of well-paid manufacturing jobs. Is there any truth to this perspective, and how does it impact the current global trading system?
Well, it's been an element of debate for a long time, and part of it is the case of the left and the right ganging up and shooting the center, which happens a lot in the trade business. The Biden trade narrative was that global economic integration, globalization, has not helped workers. It's helped big companies and their CEOs who responded to it by basically offshoring jobs and manufacturing to other countries, and that we needed to have a different approach. The Trump narrative ends up in a similar place, but with a different villain. For Trump, it's the evil foreigners that are stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, and compromising our national security. He doesn't attack American companies as much as the Biden folks did, but he ends up in the same place, which is that trade has not served the country well. If you look at poll data, it shows the opposite. For the most part, Americans are largely supportive of trade and supportive of trade agreements. It fluctuates, but it's consistently been in the 60, sometimes 70% range. It varies over time by party. Currently, there are more Democrats that support trade than Republicans. That hasn't always been true, but currently, that is, the Republicans are heavily influenced by Trump. But I think if you drill down into the debate, into the poll data, there is some, cognitive dissonance, meaning the ability to hold people to hold conflicting opinions at the same time. While people will say they support trade, the trade is good, the trade provides more consumer choice, the number of people that say it lowers prices is positive but smaller, and the number of people that say it costs jobs are greater, probably in the majority. So people can support it, but at the same time recognize that it causes problems. I think the fundamental issue has always been with trade that the gains tend to be long-term and diffuse, and the losses tend to be short-term and specific. So your T-shirt is $12.99 instead of $15.99 because of trade. You probably don't notice, but it's one of those things. In the long term, the economy grows more, people make more money. There's a mountain of data dating back 30, 40 years showing that companies that engage internationally, whether they're exporting or importing, are more profitable, hire more people, pay their workers better, and provide more benefits than companies that are not engaged internationally. So that's all sort of long-term macro data. You know, if you're working in a steel plant and the plant closes, you blame imports and you blame foreigners and you've lost your job, and you're probably in a community where there aren't a lot of other alternatives. And so there are short-term losses that are very specific. Foreigners may or may not be the villain in that case, but you'll blame them anyway. So you create, over time, we've created a constituency of people who perceive that they've suffered from trade and obviously have an interest in righting those wrongs. The irony of that is that if you listen to both Trump and Biden, when they talk about trade, most of the time they're talking about manufacturing, even though services are 75% of our economy. Right. And when they talk about manufacturing, they tend to talk about old manufacturing, heavy manufacturing, steel, automobiles, machinery, things that involve metal. I did a column once based on the Ronnie Millsap song, if you're a country western fan, Lost in the 50s Tonight. And they're both lost in the 50s. I mean, Trump dreams of a world where we make basic stuff that we haven't made in volume for a long time. And he wants to reshore that. We'll see what happens. It's hard to imagine him being able to reshore a lot of that at competitive prices. So what it means for consumers over the long term is higher prices, less choice, and probably poorer quality. So we'll see.
So it is true, though, that data shows that there is decline in the type of jobs that manufacturing used to provide, right? Good jobs that you didn't need a college degree. And they were, as you kind of said, they were the losers, and the decline has been really steady since the 1970s, but sharpened after 2001 when China became part of the WTO. Is there some way to have an open trading system, yet renew industries that could potentially provide good jobs that don't require a college degree?
Well, Trump thinks there is. That's what we're embarked on. So I guess we'll find out. If you look at the data, manufacturing jobs in the United States peaked in 1970, and they've been declining ever since. And right now they represent about 8% of our employment. That's not a lot. And we're spending an enormous amount of time focused on a relatively small part in terms of jobs of our economy. If you want to do that, that's fine. I think what we're learning in terms of workforce development is there's a lot of jobs that don't require a college degree, and they're not all factory assembly line jobs. There are plenty of jobs in the service sector and good, well-paying jobs that don't necessarily require college degrees. We did a study of this a few years ago and concluded that one of the problems in hiring was sort of qualification inflation. And employers tended to require, when they send out notices, hiring notices, they tend to have criteria that include bachelor's degrees, where an analysis of what the job actually requires suggests that isn't really necessary. And I think we're going through a period now where people are coming to understand that and are designing their job qualification standards to fit more appropriately for the actual skill requirements of the job. Keep in mind, too, that a lot more of this has to do with technology that we've been talking about. I mean, economists will tell you that the biggest reason for the manufacturing job decline is productivity improvements and technology. In the heavy manufacturing sector, in automobiles, for example, a lot of it is really the replacement of human beings by industrial robots. And go to a plant, you'll see that. There's a joke about the modern textile plant, not apparel, but people who make cloth, the textile plant, that the modern textile plant has only 2 employees, a man and a dog. And the man's job is to feed the dog, and the dog's job is to keep the man away from the machines. And that's not entirely inaccurate if you go to a modern textile plant. But keep in mind, the things that enabled globalization in the first place were technology improvements, enormous reductions in the cost of transportation and communication. These days, more than 60% of our cut flowers, fresh, are imported, mostly from Colombia, but also from Israel and the Netherlands, to name 2 others. That was just physically impossible 50 years ago. Now we have planes full of flowers that fly here every day to supply the market. Containerization has been the biggest element in reducing transportation costs. And, containers first appeared in the 60s, and it revolutionized the industry. Changes in communication. I mean, I'm really old. When I was growing up, if you wanted to call Europe, you wanted to call London, you booked it in advance, and it was usually something like $5 a minute. Now you can do it, back when there was Skype, you could do it virtually for free. And, you can move money with a few clicks. The digitization of a global economy has been transforming. None of those tools are going to get uninvented. We're going to continue to use them. And companies are going to continue to engage globally. And if you think about it, the United States is a mature, slow growth economy. If we grow at 3%, we're having a good year. 96% of the world's consumers are outside our borders. If you're an American company and you want to grow, there's only one way to grow, and that's to export. And the smart companies understand that, and they end up growing, and they hire more people and pay them better. And the companies that don't grow, don't do that, end up flatlining, basically. So I don't think that globalization is dead. It's taking a detour really around us. And that, to me, that's the most interesting thing. If you look at what's going on, the Trump message has been the United States is no longer a reliable partner. So other countries are finding new partners. I mean, that's sort of the message. So UK finished an agreement with India. The EU is just starting one with India. Canada is starting negotiations with a number of Southeast Asian countries. Turkey and the UAE are starting a discussion, I think, as is the UK with the Gulf nations. The line of countries that want to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership is getting longer. There's active negotiations right now with Costa Rica. The UK has joined. And the interesting thing, and they're not all going to get to the finish line, but the interesting thing about them is they're surprisingly conventional. They're tariff-lowering, market access, pro-market, pro-trade agreements. They're just all happening without us. Mm-hmm. So is our role in the trading system changing? Yes, we're retreating. But I think increasingly the rest of the world is going about its business normally with us on the sidewalk.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see the long-term impact, I think, of that on the United States as the rest of the world kind of integrates more along the lines of free trade.
People will develop other connections. And I mean, you see this in the short run in the retaliatory phase. I mean, China has essentially handed their soybean market to Brazil. Our soybean farmers are never going to recover from that. Mm-hmm. That market is gone. There may be some marginal changes, but essentially the Chinese have discovered somebody else is a more reliable producer at a competitive cost, at a competitive quality. Now, that's not going to happen in every sector, on every product, but when it does happen, once gone, those market shares are very hard to recover.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of leads into my next question and sort of, we talk about retaliation, but in actuality, we're getting all these agreements where they're putting 0 tariffs on U.S. goods. So we now have the highest tariffs in a century, yet contrary to economists' predictions, there's been no substantive impact on the general economy. And also surprising, companies seem to be eating the cost of tariffs rather than passing them on to consumers. So were these warnings wrong? And is America getting a good deal by, as I said, increasing tariffs in other countries while negotiating for no tariffs on U.S. products?
Well, I think there's 2 comments about that. First, I think you're right that the economic impact has been less than economists expected. I think there are 2 reasons for that. One was enormous stockpiling in Q4 last year and Q1 this year. People anticipated this was going to happen and built up their inventories, which are now getting used up. So if there's going to be an impact, you'll see it in Q3 and Q4. The other reason is that a lot of the threatened tariffs have not gone into effect. Those April 2nd tariffs never happened. There's a 10% that's gone into effect, but the others only have gone into it. Well, they're going into effect this week. So August 7th. So you can't assume that, one reason there's no reaction to the tariffs has been there haven't been any tariffs to speak of. 10% is not as big as any of the other threats. So you have to look ahead to see what's happening. So far, you're right that producers seem to have been eating the tariffs and holding off price increases. There's growing anecdotal evidence to suggest that that's going to change because as the higher tariffs kick in, that's going to be an unsustainable practice. I think the indicator to look at is the growing number of companies, and it comes out virtually every day as companies report quarterly earnings. And more companies are reporting profit declines. And profit declines means that their costs have gone up and they haven't raised their prices. So if they can, case by case, some will think, well, we can weather the storm. Maybe this will all go away. We'll just settle for lower profits for a while. Others that are in more precarious financial positions are not going to be able to do that. And we're going to find them raising their prices. So we should have this conversation again in November and see if anything has changed.
Yeah, well, you're welcome to come back in November, too. You were talking about market share. If the U.S. is getting, no tariffs for U.S. products, is that an advantage for U.S. exports?
Well, yes, if it's true. One of the very clever political things about this is that there's only one of these agreements where there's actually a text that's been made public, and that's with the United Kingdom. Everywhere else, basically, we have, in a couple cases, like Indonesia, there's a fact sheet. But most of the time, what we have is a statement by the president. And It's a very clever political strategy. He announces it. He reveals 2 or 3 things about it and no other information. And everybody, the journalists, then write stories based on what he said. And by the time they actually get more information, nobody's paying attention because they've all moved on to the next thing. So if you look at the Indonesia agreement, for example, all these agreements have discrepancies. In the case between what Trump says and what his foreign counterpart says. In the case of Indonesia, for example, Trump said that all of our stuff is going in duty-free. The Indonesian advisor to the Indonesian president said, well, not exactly. That the stuff that's coming in duty-free will be items that don't compete with Indonesian products. That's a huge difference. Look at Korea. Trump said all of our stuff is getting in free, including agriculture, including rice. Korea says we made no concessions on rice and beef. So somewhere in there, I'm not sure where the truth is. These things have to be resolved. If you look at both the UK and the EU deals, in both of those cases, the UK and the EU each think they got a deal on steel that is better than everybody else. There's the UK, the text of the UK agreement doesn't say that, but that's what the UK believes, that they're going to get. They already have a better deal with the 25% tariff instead of 50 that everybody else got. But the UK thinks that they've been promised an even better deal after a subsequent conversation about national security. The EU believes they're going to get a tariff rate quota on steel. Who knows? There's no text. So my column this week actually is about this. There's sort of 3 gaps in these deals. One are the areas where the 2 leaders actually don't agree on what was agreed to. By the way, that's not particularly unusual when leaders meet. They tend not to be detail people, and they leave the fine print to other people. And then when the others get into the fine print, they discovered that, the 2 leaders had different ideas of what, different concepts of what they'd settled on. So gap 1 are the stuff where there's no agreement. Gap 2 is where they agreed, but the fine print has to be fleshed out. Transshipment is a good example of that. We're going to have higher tariffs on what goods that are transshipped through a third country, usually from China to a third country to here. So far, there's no definition of what transshipment means. And that's a huge, huge concept. At one extreme, China ships something to Vietnam, the Vietnamese slap on a made in Vietnam label and ship it to the United States. That's customs fraud. It's been illegal for decades. It's a big enforcement issue. There's no question about that. On the other hand, China ships steel slabs to Korea. Koreans roll them into sheet, strip, and wire. Under international customs rules, that's a substantial transformation. That makes it a new product. Different tariff schedule. That makes it a product of Korea, not on China. So is the United States going to go back now to Korea and say, well, the steel was melted and poured in China. We think that makes it a Chinese product. That would upend decades of customs law. But, the United States might say, that's our definition of transshipment. All of that remains to be resolved. And then the third gap is when the administration moves the goalposts and comes back in for a second bite. Countries have asked specifically the United States, will you commit not to do that? Will you commit that the deal is a deal? And the United States answer has been no, we won't commit to that. I was in a meeting with a representative of a foreign government, and one of my colleagues said, the problem with these negotiations is they're endless. Between fleshing out all those gaps, resolving all those differences, and the administration moving the goalposts and wanting more, this is going to go on forever. So are 0 tariffs good for us? Yes, no question. If they're really 0, and if we can really take advantage of them, sure. But I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty that's going to last longer than people think before the answer to that is clear.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me to this question. that you touched on a little bit, but these trade deals since April 2nd are considered framework agreements with broad categories of goods rather than the traditional negotiated deals that were highly specific and took years to do. How does this affect their implementation? And does this mean inherently that more negotiations will be needed?
Exactly right. It means all these differences and discrepancies are going to have to be resolved sooner or later. And they'll be resolved by litigation, by dispute settlement, or more negotiation. I mean, it just depends on what happens. I mean, it'll be litigated if somebody imports something into the United States and the CBP charges a 40% tariff because it says it's transshipped. And the importer says, no, that's wrong. It wasn't transshipped. It should only be 20% if it's a Vietnamese product. Well, they're going to end up eventually in the Court of International Trade, which will deal with the facts and settle with it. Alternatively, they go back to the drawing board and define transshipment. But, even if you do that, somebody always comes up with some case that's not covered by the definition. These things are elastic terms, and a lot of it has to do with content percentages. I mean, the standard rule is if more than 50% of your content is, say, Vietnamese, that makes it a Vietnamese product.
Right.
Well, there are some people in the administration that don't want to do it that way. They want to do it based on who owns the company, not on the percent of content. That would mean that if it's a Chinese company operating in Vietnam, their product is Chinese, even if the content is entirely made in Vietnam. Now, that's not the rule. But if the United States tries to impose that rule, then you get back into having to renegotiate. So, yeah, this is going to go on for a long time. And in some cases, governments are going to see, they already know this, they see it coming. But there's a lot that they don't see coming that will end up arising when individuals try to get stuff in the country and discover that their understanding of the rules is not the same as CBP's understanding of the rules. And then you end up in court.
Right. I mean, how effective are these courts?
Well, we'll see. There's a big one underway right now, which addresses the entire question of the president's authority to impose all these tariffs in the first place. The Court of International Trade ruled 3-0 that he couldn't do that. Of course, that was appealed. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which is the one that gets all the CIT appeals, their hearing was last week. We'll see what they do. They skipped a step, which suggests this is on a fairly fast track. Instead of assigning it to a 3-judge panel, which is a normal thing to do it, the entire court heard the case, which is good because it means that once they issue a ruling, there's only one next step, which is to go to the Supreme Court,
right? Which
will certainly happen. No matter who loses, they'll appeal. So the Supremes get it probably this fall. Will they make a decision? And they'll take it up, I think, for sure. So will they make a decision by the end of the year? Maybe. Will it sit till next June? Maybe. Trump has indicated, at least on the immigration side, a willingness to ignore court orders up until the Supreme Court. He has not said that he'll ignore Supreme Court orders. When it comes to trade, I think these things are going to get there eventually. So, we'll see what he does. And, with the Supreme Court, when it comes to economics, they're unpredictable. This is not a court that normally focuses on economic issues. They focus on constitutional issues, regulatory issues, powers of the president, big picture things like that. When they get economic issues, the outcome is unpredictable. Does not always follow ideological lines. So it's very hard to say where they'll come out. In the IEPA case, which is the one I've been talking about, the issue is whether Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which reserves the tariff-setting power to Congress, has any meaning, or whether the president can override it. The court said no so far. The conservative wing of the Supreme Court that tends to be strict constructionists, if they believe their own past rhetoric, they should probably agree with that and rein in the president. But who knows?
Yeah. So if Trump does win and it's found that he can levy tariffs without the need to have the buy-in of Congress, would the next president be able to get rid of them just as easily?
Well,
or do they have a stickiness?
The question this week has been whether the next president will even want to get rid of them.
Right.
Because they raise a lot of money. And they don't raise as much money, I think, as Trump says they're going to raise. But then again, it depends on what tariffs are finally imposed and how long they last. Because with Trump, everything is negotiable. So even if they're imposed, that doesn't mean that a month from now he can't change his mind and do something different if a country comes in with another offer. But, they will raise a pile of money, and the government will be dependent on that. So there's speculation that whoever the next president is, they may find them quite comfortable. My sense has been, if Trump will work very hard to make sure that the next Republican nominee is committed to continuing his policies. So if that person is elected, he'll probably continue his policies. The Democrats will have more of a struggle on this issue. Biden did not get rid of Trump's China tariffs, for example. My guess about a Democratic president is they wouldn't make it worse. They'll probably be cautious and slow about changing anything. I mean, I don't see us going back to the status quo ante. There's a lot of unfairness in what Trump is doing, and I can see the Democrats trying to correct that. What's going to come out, it's already coming out, are individual stories of people, and it's usually a small business person. And my hypothetical, which I will keep mentioning, is some little old lady in Southern Ohio runs a 12-person operation making something. Her main input comes from China, and she's going to at one point say, my effective tariff now is 55%. I can't stay in business. I have to lay all these people off, and I'm going to go broke. And she'll complain to her local paper, and the New York Times will pick it up, and it will go viral. And then there will be 1,000 of those, because there's going to be 1,000 of those cases. And then Trump has to decide, what do I say to these people? Did I just say, well, that's tough, move on? Or more likely, he's going to say, we need a process to allow people to come in and ask the government to fix that, which is what he did in his first term. And actually, I think it's a process he kind of likes because it gives him more power. He can grant basically dispensation to these people one by one. He hasn't done that this time, but I think he will. And if he doesn't, I think the Democrats will, because otherwise what happens is the people that are victims, they go into their their representative and senator and complain. And the representative doesn't like to say, I can't help you, because the constituent is going to say, yes, you can. You can vote down these tariffs. You have the power. But the representative would rather say, there's a process you can use where you can apply for an exemption. So I think Trump is going to eventually come under pressure to put that in place. And if he doesn't, I think the next president of either party will probably do it. But otherwise, pressure is going to build up because, when you try to paint with broad strokes, just what he's doing, inevitably you paint yourself into a corner.
So staying on the topic of tariffs, Trump's also using tariffs for political purposes. For example, placing 50% tariffs on Brazil, citing the prosecution of Jair Bolsonaro, his ally, who's accused of plotting a coup after he lost the last presidential election. Is this action unprecedented? Does it differ in any way from traditional sanctions?
It's not unprecedented. It goes back a long way. Actually, we did this something similar to Japan in the late 30s. Some people believe led to Pearl Harbor. I don't think that's on the table right now, but it's not unprecedented. In fact, the most recent precedent is China. China has reinvented economic coercion. Ask the Australians, the Koreans, ask the Lithuanians or the Norwegians about that. China has mastered the art of using trade as a weapon to achieve political objectives. So Trump didn't create this. He's actually stealing it from China. It's a really worrisome development because it's essentially an infringement on the other country's sovereignty, which is hard to negotiate, So in the Brazilian case, Trump's telling the Brazilian Supreme Court, an entity that is independent of the United States and independent of the Brazilian president, to render the verdict that Trump wants and not the verdict that has the legal duty to decide. A sovereign country can never agree to that. Mm-hmm. So there's not really anything to negotiate. And that's why this is such a worrisome development. If he does this more often, other countries are at that point are going to draw the line and stand up. Most of them have drawn the line in the abstract by asserting their sovereignty. But, when you're negotiating tariffs, that's not the same thing. That's not about sovereignty. That's about market access and economics. When you try to get them to do something that's contrary to their own laws, then that's when you run into trouble. So I hope it's not a trend. I hope it's one-off, but I'm very nervous about that.
I've done some work on how even when China does this, it's effective at punishing these countries, but not in actually changing their foreign policies. So it seems like really hard to use tariffs in that manner.
You're right. It generally doesn't work. When the Chinese punished the Norwegians because they gave Liu Xiaobo the Nobel Peace Prize, the Norwegians didn't take the prize away. Lithuania didn't change its Taiwan policy. When they punished Korea by closing down a bunch of Korean facilities, including department stores in China, because of the missile defense system that the Koreans bought, the Koreans didn't abandon the system.
Exactly.
So you're right. It doesn't really work, but that doesn't stop people from doing it anyway. They just feel they have to. It's a bully tactic. It's classic bullying. There was a book review this weekend in the Post of Robert Reich's new book, where he basically frames all of human history as basically the struggle to contain bullies. And he has a point.
Yeah, I think that I agree with that for sure. So one thing, you have these 90-day extensions for Mexico in a trade deal and extensions given to China. And it seems like that's probably in part the result of the fact that these are the U.S.'s largest trading partners. Yet Canada is also one of our largest trading partners. And instead of an extension, Trump has increased tariffs on it to 35%. What explains this discrepancy?
Yeah, I don't really understand it. All the other issues, he's ended up treating them the same. And on this one, he hasn't. I think there's probably a couple reasons. One, a lot of what Trump does depends on how he feels about his counterpart. He seems to like President Sheinbaum so far. She's handled him well. His relationship with the Canadian Prime Minister has been, I guess, uncomfortable. He didn't like Trudeau and was very clear about that. One would have thought that after Trudeau left the scene and there was a new one, it was kind of time to start over. The Canadians have shown themselves over decades to be very tough negotiators. If you look at some of the outstanding issues we have with them, lumber, for example, is a big one. We've been arguing with them about lumber for 40 years. I remember that. When I was working in the Senate in the 80s, is when the lumber issue first came up. There's not a lot of give on the Canadian side, or on our side for that matter. And we just keep going back and forth, measures and countermeasures. So they've proved difficult to bully. And I think Trump has not yet, descended to personal attacks on Carney. Probably he will eventually. He does that to almost everybody else. But so far, he's not done that. But I suspect that Ambassador Greer and Secretary Lutnick and Secretary Bessent told him they weren't making any progress. And so this was his answer. Because he only has one answer. If he's impatient, if he doesn't like the way things are going, he ups the ante. He imposes a new requirement. And then we'll see what happens. So far, I'm not sure it's brought the Canadians to the table. mean, he did this before on the digital services tax, and threatened big tariffs on them. And the Canadians folded on that one. So maybe he just figured they'll fold again when he went to 35%. Give it a week. Maybe they will.
Makes sense. And moving on to China. So China presents numerous challenges to the United States' national security, including innovation and critical technologies, ownership of supply chain bottlenecks, such as rare earth minerals, and its willingness to use its economy, as we've mentioned, to punish and attempt to change the foreign policy of other nations. As a result, there is a rare bipartisan sentiment that something needs to be done to ensure the U.S. out-innovates China and to reduce the reliance on Chinese goods in our supply chains. However, the parties differ on how to go about doing so. So former President Biden focused on industrial policy to have more semiconductors built in the U.S. and restrict the export of high-tech chips, while President Trump has reversed much of this policy and instead argues that tariffs will grow American manufacturing and reduce dependence on Chinese goods. How do these policies compare, and does either approach do enough to address strategic concerns?
Well, it's tempting, but I think because of recent events I'll get to, too simple to say Biden's a run faster guy and Trump is a trip the other guy. Mm-hmm. The metaphor I usually use in dealing with this question is the marathon metaphor. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a marathon, there's only two ways to win. You run faster than the other guy, or you trip the other guy, which you can't do in marathons. But in international trade competition, you can get away with it. In fairness, both presidents are applying both strategies. It's a kind of a question of emphasis. The Biden emphasis was very clearly, I think, on the industrial policy emphasis. How can we make ourselves more competitive so that basically we can beat the Chinese at their own game? The one difference between them that shows up in industrial policy is Biden was a carrot guy and Trump's a stick guy. Biden's approach to industrial policy was bribery. Let's provide loans, subsidies, tax breaks to companies that will build here, locate here. Let's increase the research budget. Let's do more R&D here, and let's promote reshoring of manufacturing here. All of that makes sense, I think, if it's a rational way to get to his goal. Trump has the same goal, reshoring manufacturing, but he tends to use sticks rather than carrots, namely threats and tariffs, saying if you don't come back here, you'll pay more. Mm-hmm. I think his view is that's cheaper. I don't have to spend any money. In fact, I make money if they don't do what I say. It's too soon to tell whether that's working or not, because making a decision to reshore and actually doing it takes years for most people. And in the case of something like critical minerals, it takes longer than that. In the United States, the average time between discovery of an ore deposit and commercial production is 16 and a half years. Even if you have permitting reform, you're going to reduce it, Even if you reduce it by 75%, you're still talking about 4 years. None of this stuff happens quickly, and it happens based on economic realities like the price of the items in question and environmental, in the case of minerals, environmental issues and NIMBY issues. Try to find a neighborhood that wants a lithium plant next door. Right. It's going to be very difficult. So they both are, in that respect, I think, they both have the same goal, running faster goal. They're using different tools to get there. One carrots, one sticks. We'll see what happens. Trump is unraveling a bunch of Biden's carrots, so we may never know what the outcome would have been. We'll find out what the outcome of the stick strategy is in the next few years as it plays out. I think one area where the analogy doesn't hold is on export controls and technology transfer, because recent signs indicate that Trump is on the verge of pursuing a different policy, which is annoying the China hawks in Congress and in his own administration. So we'll see how far he gets. But I used to have this job in the Clinton administration. We really developed the policy of basically a flexible control standard based on the U.S. running faster. So our aim was to keep the adversary, in this case, China. It's not the only adversary, but in this case, we'll talk about China, to keep them a generation or two behind us technologically. And the theory was, as long as they were behind, we could sell them old stuff. And we would make a lot of money selling them old stuff. And in the beginning, that worked for them because they didn't have any stuff at the high end. You know, we could sell them a couple generations of older stuff, run faster, make a lot of money, which our companies could then invest in the next generation of technology. I would argue about 10 years ago, that policy began to run out of gas because China decided to go it alone, you know, and to develop their own technology that was outside of U.S. export controls. The Biden administration's response to that was to change U.S. policy and basically set a flat line of performance parameters. Said if your performance is better than the line, above the line, then, although that really means in terms of things like line width with chips below the line, but if your performance is better, it's controlled, period. And the line's not going to move unless, of course, we change it. So what that meant in practice was that the universe of stuff subject to controls was going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as U.S. technology advanced, but the line stayed here. So more and more stuff got subject to control. We have a 4-part series on the implications of that policy. And we concluded that it didn't yet affect U.S. company revenue, but it will as the pot grows. It didn't change Chinese policy, but it probably accelerated their efforts to design their own products. And we've done 4 papers on the design out issue, the extent to which the extent to which the Chinese are successfully designing us out of their products.
Right.
And 2 are published. 1 is about to be, and the 4th one is, I just got the draft last week. I think it looks like Trump is changing this now. If you listen to David Sachs, his AI czar, and if you listen to Secretary Lutnick, they're saying the best strategy, at least for AI and the AI tech stack, is to flood the zone. It's in our security interest to have everybody using our technology, make it a global standard, and basically isolate the Chinese. The implication of that is we free up export controls and sell that stuff to everybody except China. That appears to be what we're doing, which is very different from the Biden approach, and which has aroused a lot of anxiety on the Hill. There's letters to the administration, I think from both parties, asking, what are you doing? You know, and to ask them to explain themselves. And there will probably be hearings when Congress returns. So I don't know where this is going to go. It has perils, because if you do it, you end up, in all probability, promoting leakage and selling high-end technology to countries that are going to resell it to China. And that maybe in the end may be self-defeating. The administration's gamble, I think, is that they can, make U.S. AI tech stacks a global standard and everybody's going to buy it. Think of the analogy as Microsoft's Windows. Windows may or may not actually be the best thing, but they did a brilliant job of getting everybody to use it, including in China. So if you could do that, then you've successfully embedded the American approach in everybody else's technology. And the Trump people seem to think that's the better course of action. That's very different from Biden. And it's not a trip the other guy approach as much as it is a run faster and get everybody else to run faster with you approach. Sorry for the long answer, but it's complicated.
Yeah, and those are all interesting points. And yeah, all of this is very complicated. So even if it wanted to, the U.S. cannot make all the goods it buys from China. Therefore, decoupling from China requires friendshoring, of which supply chain dependencies are shifted to our allies, making them less vulnerable to potential conflicts with China and other non-aligned states. Yet trade tensions with allies have been increasing. For example, Trump recently placed 25% tariffs on India and the aforementioned 35% on Canada. Are these policies at odds with each other, or will political necessity overcome these tensions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Both Biden and Trump have given lip service to friendshoring. Mm-hmm. We've done some papers on it in the pharmaceutical industry sector and recommended a trusted trade partner approach and we laid out what criteria for what would make a trusted trade partner. So far, certainly in Biden, my conclusion was it was lip service. They didn't really mean it, but they talked about it. So far in Trump, I think it's the same thing. They don't talk about it nearly as much. And I don't think Trump wants reshoring. They both want reshoring. They want to bring it all back here. That's not really feasible, but that's right. What they want. Friendshoring is probably the most rational way to go. As I wrote in one of my columns, the challenge is figuring out who's a friend, right. Which turns out to be harder than you think. Is India a friend? Is Saudi Arabia a friend? Is Turkey a friend? They're a NATO ally. These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. Apparently, on AI anyway, the president has decided that the United Arab Emirates is a friend because he's made deals to build data centers there and to sell them AI advanced technologies. That's what I was referring to earlier. I don't know if they're friends or not. I guess it's the right strategy, I think. I'm not sure that it's being properly employed with Trump. And I'm not sure that they have their heart is in it anyway. David Sachs says this is what we ought to do. We'll see how far they go with that, which countries they end up partnering with.
Yeah, those are some very good points and something I've thought a lot about, and we talk about it in my classes. So to kind of wrap up the discussion, what do you think are going to be the lasting effects of Trump's trade policies, at least as they've been expressed so far?
If he continues with them, and they become embedded in our system, I think in the very long term, meaning 10, 20 years, you're just going to see the United States becoming isolated in the global economic community. Countries are going to make connections with other people, with other countries, and they're going to become routinized, and there's going to be a new equilibrium. I mean, there's always, after there's a period of disruption, then there's a new equilibrium that develops. People get used to it, and it'll be one where we're less important than we were before. I mean, the Trump view is the opposite. It's that access to the American market is so important because we're so big that other countries will pay for it. In the short run, a lot of them are. Mm-hmm. But even the ones that are, at the same time, they're searching for alternatives. Go back to what I said about these other negotiations that are going on. And I didn't mention all of them. We published a paper that has a longer list if people care to look it up. So I think, in the short run, what he's doing may work. In the long run, I think it leaves us off by ourselves. And eventually, relatively speaking, we've always been a little bit more by ourselves. Trade has never been as big a part of our GDP as it has been for other countries. We're still, despite decades of globalization, total trade is still, 25, 26, 27% of our GDP. In Europe, it's in the 40s. Mm-hmm. We've always been less dependent on trade than other countries. And now that percentage will probably go down. The economists will say that's to our detriment. We'll have less consumer choice. And the stuff that is imported will be more expensive, which is why we'll have less choice. I think what it means in the long run is you're going to see centers of innovation going elsewhere. Mm. Other countries are going to innovate. People are busy these days talking about the AI race between the US and China. And they have charts about, because you could break AI down into lots of different pieces. They have charts showing who's ahead, us or China. And the reality is China's ahead in a number of those parts. They're ahead in a number of biotech areas. Other people at CSIS produced a major study on that in April, I think. They're developing their own commercial aircraft. They're not just flooding the market with cheap stuff. If you look at EVs, for example, they're producing very efficient, high-quality electric vehicles at prices that we can't match. Trump doesn't care about EVs. The result of that is probably we'll be slower than other countries to adopt them. But the point is not that. The point is that centers of innovation are popping up in other countries. And that's going to continue. And, we'll keep doing what we're doing, and that'll be good. But in 20, 30 years, it won't be the best anymore. And then we're going to say, what happened? And historians are going to write about it all began in the late 20s.
Yeah, the effects on innovation in particular are quite concerning.
It also produces, which you can also already see, trade fragmentation. There's data that shows that while trade is not declining, this is post-COVID. I mean, COVID disrupted everything, but while trade is not declining, it seems to be rearranging. And the data suggests that like-minded countries are trading more with each other. So in other words, democracies are trading more with democracies, and authoritarian states are trading more with authoritarian states. And there's a very large number of countries in the middle that are trying to avoid being forced to choose.
Right.
And that fragments the system. You see it most dramatically in the digital economy and control of the internet, countries pursuing data localization strategies and content control strategies that are certainly antithetical to the First Amendment, but we're really the only country that has a First Amendment. Other countries have different attitudes about that. So if you break up the internet and just simply say that multinational companies can't function multinationally, you're really going to put a crimp in trade. And so in the short term, I kind of worry about things like that. They're very hard to sort out. The EU has a policy on privacy and digital regulation that we don't like. China has the Great Firewall and an extreme policy on content control that we really don't like, but we don't have a policy. We have, I think, 7 states that have a policy, but the United States doesn't have a policy. And what I learned on the Hill is it's very hard to fight something with nothing, and you can go back to the EU and say, we don't like what you're doing. And the EU says, well, what do you want us to do? And the U.S. answer is basically, well, we don't know. So until we settle some of these issues internally, I think the global situation is going to get more complicated rather than less complicated.
Well, those are great insights. And I would love to talk to you more because you brought up some really interesting issues. But I want to be respectful of your time. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Really been a pleasure.
Happy to do it. Always fun to talk about this stuff. And seriously, it would be good to do a reprise a few months from now to see if any of the stuff I said is actually happening.
Yeah, we'll definitely plan on doing that.
There are certain dangers in it. One of the dangers I've learned in this business, or one of the things I've learned in this business, is that you can often get away with your predictions because by the time they turn out to be right or wrong, everybody's forgotten them because they moved on to other things. And if you're right, you could come back and remind everybody that you were right. And if you're wrong, you just go on to the next thing. So I say with some trepidation, maybe we should do this again. Accountability is always dangerous. The joke amongst the economists is, provide a number or a date, but never both. We'll see. But, in fairness, a lot of things that we're talking about may play out differently over the next 3 or 4 months. And it'd be fun to come back and see who was right about that. Maybe Trump will turn out to be right. My gut instinct is that the truth of these things is almost always somewhere in the middle. It won't be the next golden age, like he says, but it won't be the next Great Depression either, like some economists say. It'll be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I agree with you. And yeah, I'd love to have you back on. So we'll try to schedule something.
Okay.
It'd be great.
Fun talking to you.
Yeah, same. Thank you so much. Well, I think this brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on X at Global Kellogg or me, AR Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email. So Anita at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for the articles we discussed in this episode.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.